So we're going to look now at the case of Mr James Herbert and his death in Avon and Somerset in June of 2010. Now we're going to look at some of the circumstances of the death and also around the criminal liability aspects and the investigation. In the follow-on video we'll be looking at the issues around the anatomy in relation to the restraints. So first off, just looking at a summary and looking at the timeline. So on the 10th of June 2010, police received a call that James Herbert was placing himself in danger by running into the path of traffic on Bath Road in Wells, Somerset. After officers attended the incident, James was restrained and transported to Yeovil Police Station in a caged vehicle. On arrival, James was carried into the cells and within minutes an ambulance was called as James Herbert had stopped breathing. He was pronounced dead shortly after 9 p.m. James Herbert had been detained under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. 3 sets of limb restraints had been used, which was on the wrists, the ankles and the knees. There were 2 IPCC investigations, 1 inquest, 1 referral to CPS for consideration of criminal liability, 1 referral to internal discipline procedures, and it took until 2017 for officers to be informed that there was no case to answer. So we need to have a look at what happened, and what we're going to do is use as a reference point the IPCC 6 Mischances report, which was dated September of 2017. So extracts from that report. In the early evening, police were called to Bath Road where James was seen to be acting in a bizarre manner. A PCSO was first on scene, but he quickly called for assistance because on his own he could not prevent James from running into the road and thus putting himself and potentially other road users at risk. James was not threatening or violent at this point. A police officer arrived and almost immediately James was on the ground and being restrained, including by members of the public. In quick succession, his hands were cuffed and limb restraints were applied around his knees and ankles. It is significant that this resistance was only evident after force was used against him. We do know that he remained subject to this level of heavy restraint continuously until his arrival at the custody suite. There were at this point a number of vital warning signs and risk factors, but these were either missed by the police or not taken into consideration. It was a hot June day and James was wearing a heavy winter coat, which restricted his ability to move and must have led to him becoming very overheated, especially in his distressed state and agitated state. Once restrained, James's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. He was out of breath, clammy with sweat and red-faced, but he was not recognised as a medical emergency. The police were given information which indicated he may have taken drugs, legal highs. He needed to go to hospital, but instead he was carried to a police van and put into a cramped caged area. He then endured a lengthy journey of about 45 minutes with speeds of up to 50 or 60 miles per hour at certain points during the journey, while in limb restraints, alone and unsecured in the back of the van. At Yeovil Police Station, a reception committee of officers was waiting for him, ready to help those transporting James to get him into the cells. They were not expecting or prepared for the arrival of a seriously ill young man, and they did not treat him as such. James was carried face down on a blanket to a police cell where he was left naked on a bare cement floor. He was unresponsive and remained so, but rather than call for urgent medical assistance, officers withdrew, leaving him alone. When medical help was summoned by the custody sergeant, he contacted the call centre, not 999, and the level of urgency was not made clear. Initially, technicians were sent and paramedics did not arrive until 10 minutes later. In spite of attempts to save James, he remained unresponsive and was taken by ambulance to Yeovil District Hospital. He was pronounced dead at 9:21. Now, James's initial detention, a police community support officer was the first to attend. This PCSO had spoken to James about half an hour earlier. He tried to talk to James again this time and usher him off the road. James was not behaving aggressively towards the PCSO, but he was not cooperating and thus continuing to put himself and other road users at risk by running into the road. The PCSO radioed for assistance. Members of the public came out of a nearby pub, the Britannia Inn to try and help, initially by alerting and slowing down traffic. Within 10 minutes, a PC arrived in a police van and attempted to get James out of the road. Once James was out of the road and on the ground, the PC restrained him with the help of the PCSO and members of the public. James had not been aggressive at this point. However, the PC stated he chose to restrain him to prevent James from running back into the road. As he was being handcuffed and held, James began to struggle and shout. The PC radioed for further police assistance and 2 officers came to the scene. The handcuffs were reapplied, this time with James's hands behind his back. 2 sets of leg restraints were also applied. James was then carried into the police van, still shouting and struggling. At around this time, James's mother, Mrs. Barbara Montgomery, arrived. She spoke to James and also to officers requesting that James receive medical attention. An officer assured her that James would receive medical attention once he calmed down. The first PC that had arrived on the scene, accompanied by one of the pair that arrived in response to his request for assistance, then took James in the van from Wells to Yeovil, where the nearest designated custody station was. This is a distance of approximately 27 miles and the journey took around 45 minutes. The only accounts of the journey come from the 2 officers. According to these accounts, James continued to shout and struggle, then would go quiet for a period before shouting and banging again. During one of the quiet periods, the officers stopped the van to check on James. Immediately, he started shouting again. They resumed the journey. James continued to shout during most of the journey as well as bang on the metal cage. The officers radioed for colleagues to be ready at Yeovil police station to help them take James out of the van. They arrived at Yeovil shortly after 8 p.m. At the station. On arrival, James was quiet, but reportedly breathing heavily. The 2 PCs were helped by 4 others to carry James out of the van and into the police cell, where he was placed face down on the floor, so put into prone. The handcuffs and both sets of leg restraints were removed, as was James's clothing. The mattress that had been in the cell had been removed by the custody sergeant when James was still in the police yard. The officers left the cell one by one. Initially, James had been mumbling, but once he was in the cell, he was quiet. He had shown no signs of resistance since arriving at Yeovil. After the last officer had left the cell, 2 officers continued to monitor James. He did not react or move, so within a minute they went back into the cell. James still did not react. His breathing had become shallow and he started shaking. An ambulance was called at 8:18 p.m. Shortly after, James was observed to have stopped breathing and the officers attempted CPR. Ambulance technicians arrived and on being informed James was in cardiac arrest, immediately requested paramedic assistance. The ambulance crew continued to try and revive James using a defibrillator, and when the paramedic arrived, she administered intravenous injections. However, he remained unresponsive and shortly before 9 p.m. was taken by ambulance to Yeovil District Hospital. He was pronounced dead at 9:21. So, responding to James's death, there have been several investigations into these tragic events, including the coroner's inquest referred to above, which returned a narrative verdict, and 2 IPCC investigations, both of which identified officers as having a case to answer for misconduct. In the investigator's opinion, there was a case to answer for gross misconduct for an acting inspector in respect of evidence given at the inquest. The acting inspector was cleared at a misconduct hearing in September of 2017. The investigator also found a case to answer for gross misconduct for a former custody sergeant, and misconduct for 3 police constables and a PCSO. Management action was agreed by the force for one of the police constables and the PCSO. No further action can be taken in respect of the former custody sergeant, who retired following 30 years service, and 2 of the police constables who have since died. So the 6 mischances that were identified by the IPCC investigation: first, during the day, a mischance to avert a crisis. Secondly, at the roadside, a mischance to de-escalate. Third, once James was restrained, a mischance to release the pressure. Fourth, the decision to take James to a police station, a mischance to get immediate mental health support. Fifth, during the journey, a mischance to check on James's well-being. And 6, on arrival, a missed medical emergency. So we're going to have a brief look at these 6 points in relation to what the investigation concluded. So first one, during the day, a mischance to avert a crisis. The summary of events sets out above began at a point in the early evening when the police responded to several calls from the public about a man behaving strangely in the road. It was the police response to this specific incident which led to James being taken into custody. However, this was not the first time that Avon and Somerset's constabulary had responded to incidents involving James that day. In total, 5 different officers directly interacted with James 3 separate times before 1 p.m. that day, and a 6th issued a radio messages concerning him. At 6:23 p.m, Avon and Somerset Constabulary received a further call about James, this time from his mother, who was concerned that James was missing from home. According to the police call log, she told the call handler that James really needs a mental health assessment and that officers had advised that they would contact social services. It is possible that this previous assessment influenced the actions of officers a year later. They had raised concerns but been assured that James's mental health was fine. But just like physical illness, mental illness can develop quickly. It can also be episodic. People talk about having bouts of depression, for instance. Given this, it's crucial that officers understand that a previous mental health assessment or diagnosis does not necessarily hold true at the time they respond to an incident. So secondly, the areas around the roadside and a mischance to de-escalate. All of these prior interactions with James are being considered as one mischance. There are some differences in the accounts between different witnesses about the exact sequence of events. What they all agree on, however, is that this process happened very quickly after the first PC arrived. Furthermore, they agree that once on the ground and restrained, James began to struggle. In short, the situation escalated quickly from one in which James had been non-compliant but non-threatening to one in which he was struggling forcefully and perceived by the police to be threatening. In short, the situation escalated quickly from one in which James had been non-compliant but non-threatening to one in which he was struggling forcefully and perceived by the police to be threatening. So third area, once James was restrained, a mischance to release the pressure. The accounts of the officers are clear. Once James was restrained, being held on the ground and handcuffed, he began to resist forcefully. Officers and members of the public described being shocked by his strength. James was reportedly kicking and thrashing his arms, and the PCSO thought he was threatening to bite those who were restraining him. Though witnesses provided different recollections about the exact timings and sequence of events, it is accepted that James was initially handcuffed with his hands to the front. Because he was struggling, the handcuffs were removed and reapplied with his arms behind his back, which is a more restrictive position. Around the time, 2 additional PCs arrived. 2 sets of leg restraints were also applied. James continued to struggle forcefully against the officers and the restraint. The officers decided to take him into the police van where he could be locked in a cage. The majority of witnesses' accounts indicate that James continued to struggle while being carried. He was placed in the cage head first, and officers stated that he was initially seated upright, with his back against the rear wall of the cage. Once James was in the van and the doors were closed, members of the public described hearing sounds that indicated he was striking the cage. Given that the only part of his body that was wholly free to move was his head, these noises suggest that James was banging his head against the cage and thus risking a head injury. So continued on this one, based on the accounts of officers and members of the public, there is no evidence that at any point did officers appear to consider the possibility of reducing the restraint to see if that would help calm James down. There is no evidence that officers at any point advised James that if he stopped resisting, he might be released, or that the pressure being applied would or could be reduced. They told him to calm down, but did not offer the incentive of reduced restraint. Shortly after James was placed in the van, his mother, Mrs Montgomery, arrived. She attempted to speak to James and also spoke to the officers. She mentioned to them that he had been taking legal highs and requested he be given medical assistance. She was assured that he would receive medical assistance once he had calmed down. The additional information she gave was noted down but not passed on or acted upon. So the fourth area, the decision to take James to a police station, a mischance to get immediate mental health support. Under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act 1983, if a constable finds in a place to which the public have access a person who appears to him to be suffering from mental disorder, and to be in immediate need of care or control, the constable may, if he thinks it necessary to do so, in the interests of that person or for the protection of other persons, remove that person to a place of safety. In the circumstances, the use of Section 136 may well have been appropriate. James inarguably was in immediate need of care and medical attention. However, once Section 136 is applied, it should trigger a process to get relevant support and treatment for the patient being detained. This process was not followed correctly for James following his detention. Rather than being treated as a patient would be, he was treated as if he was a violent criminal suspect. Point 5, during the journey, a mischance to check on James's well-being. According to the accounts of officers in the van that transported James from Wells to Yeovil, James continued to struggle during the journey. They could hear him shouting and banging. At one point, he went quiet, so they stopped the van. This was about 9 or 10 miles into the journey. ACPO guidance on transporting people in custody is clear. Detainees should not be left alone and unsupervised in vehicles. An officer must be able to observe and monitor the person and react to any situation which may arise. The inquest verdict in James' case was clear. In response to the coroner's question, were there any matters of concern that may have contributed to Mr Herbert's death, the jury highlighted a lack of monitoring of James throughout the journey as a factor that may have contributed to his death. They also cited the failure to call for medical assistance en route to, or at least on arrival at Yeovil Custody Suite, as a potentially contributory factor. The sixth area, on arrival, a missed medical emergency. On arrival at Yeovil Police Station at 8:03 p.m, as recorded on CCTV, the van carrying James was met by a reception committee of 7 officers. They were there to help take James out of the van and into custody. This was clearly something that was relatively common practice, but only when dealing with violent prisoners. The accounts of some of the officers who met the van indicated that this is what they were expecting. James, however, was a patient. He showed no signs of violence. He was reportedly slumped over in a state of undress. He did not respond when spoken to. The only noises he made were described as grunting. According to several accounts, officers were sufficiently concerned to check James was breathing and had a pulse. Once this was confirmed, they began the process of manoeuvring him out of the van. James was taken out of the van and placed on the ground on his back. He was rolled onto his front and then carried headfirst by around 6 officers into a cell. This took at least 2 minutes, as officers were careful not to let James hit the walls. Throughout, James was motionless and unresponsive. Though some officers' accounts state he was making a grumbling noise, some accounts indicate his breathing was heavy, some that it was shallow. Once in the cell, the officers performed a cell extraction, a standard process that allows a team of officers to leave the cell one by one. This is designed to protect the officers if a prisoner becomes violent. The officers placed James on the floor and his clothing was removed, along with the handcuffs and 2 sets of leg restraints. Still, James did not react, though officers stated he was breathing. After the last officer left the cell and James did not respond or move, officers became concerned that he was not faking. Some officers went back into the cell almost immediately to put James into the recovery position. 2 of the officers who had helped carry James continued to monitor him through the cell door, and within a couple of minutes went back into the cell where they found James was not breathing. CPR was attempted and an ambulance called. Recommendations that came from this inquiry. Firstly, that police officers responding to an incident involving some with mental health problems should prioritise the welfare and safety of all those involved, including the patient. Secondly, officers should be effectively trained in verbal de-escalation as the default response to any incident involving someone with mental health problems. Officers should be trained to use containment rather than restraint when dealing with anyone who has or appears to have mental health problems. Each local force should ensure that it has in place robust, effective and relevant local protocols that support police officers in the discharge of their duties, backed by effective working relationship with other agencies on how to respond to incidents involving someone with mental health problems. And fifth, forces should develop clear processes for the recording and sharing of information about individuals who are known to or are suspected to have mental health problems. Now, in relation to the criminal liability, this was then being looked at from 2010. And here reported in Police Professional magazine, and there's a link if you want to see the exact advert article. The headline is CPS considering death in custody prosecutions. 2 police officers could face criminal charges and a force may be liable over potential health and safety breaches after the death of a man in police custody, February the 2nd, 2016. 2 police officers could face criminal charges and the force may be liable over potential health and safety breaches after the health of a man in police custody, after death of a man in police custody. James Herbert, 25, died of a cardiac arrest in Yeovil Police Station in June 2010. So that's circumstances of the death. And what we're then going to move on to now is looking at the issues around the criminal liability factor and also the use of force and the anatomy and physiology and the impacts of various different kinds of restraints on people, in addition to the likes of any mental ill health episode and or any intoxication.